Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this first webinar organized by the Bio4Products project. My name is Bert van der Beld, Director Technology at BGG Biomass Technology Group from the Netherlands. I'm the coordinator of Bio4Products and also the moderator for today. Before starting with the presentation, some technical aspects of this webinar as shown on the screen. The webinar will be recorded. You are in a listen-only mode, but please send us your questions through the question box on the left side of the screen. We will start with 3 presentations and have a Q&A session at the end. And participants who registered today will also be invited to the next webinars unless you tell us otherwise. First, a few words about the Bio4Products project. It is a European project funded by the Horizon 2020 SPIRE program. It concerns the development of a new bio-based products derived from biomass via fast pyrolysis, as illustrated in the figure on the right side of this screen. The value chain starts from sustainable biomass, which is converted into fast pyrolysis oil and subsequently fractionated in different fractions. These fractions are then used as a raw material in bio-based products. Examples under development are insulation foam, phenolic and sand molding resins, and modified wood. As part of Bio4Products, we will organize a series of webinars. This is the first one. In the next month, we will organize 3 more webinars covering different parts of the whole value chain. So today's webinar is about the first part of the value chain, selecting the right biomass. We have 3 presentations. We invited 2 external speakers to talk about this. Sonja is a postdoctoral scientist at the Leibniz Institute for Agricultural Engineering and Bioeconomy since 2012. The scientific work focuses on the impacts of land use or land management on nutrient and water fluxes and hence on the environment. She's very experienced in working on EU projects such as Euro pruning and advanced fuel, where she's responsible for analyzing the potential for upgrading feedstock production and supply for advanced liquid biofuels. In her presentation, she will talk about innovation in lignocellulosic biomass production, effects on cost, sustainability, and acceptance. So please, Sonja, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Bert. This talk is based on a collaboration of our project Advanced Fuel with 6 other EU projects. And it focuses, as said, on lignocellulosic cropping systems in Europe, mainly on marginal land. Advanced Fuel wants to remove barriers to renewable transport fuels. In order not to compete with food and feed, the project concentrates on second-generation fuels and therefore on lignocellulosic biomass as feedstock. One major barrier are the feedstock production costs. Therefore, our main purpose here was the identification and evaluation of promising innovative cropping schemes of lignocellulosic crops in Europe in terms of biomass production cost, environmental impact, innovation acceptance by farmers and the public. Which are the fields of innovation? We based our work on a report published by the European Commission, as you can see here, a workshop Advanced Fuel organized and to which we invited 6 other EU projects, and an in-depth literature review. We used this to formulate the fields of innovation, and within each of these fields we described options of innovations in lignocellulosic cropping. A detailed description of our results is available in this Advanced Fuel deliverable, which you can find on our webpage. And these are the 8 fields of innovation that we identified. I don't have the time to go in detail, but I want to tell you in which cases the projects focused in our workshop. So Magic and Grace focused on miscanthus cropping. And as we will see later, breeding has high innovation potential for miscanthus. The Libio project is suggesting to select a new crop to grow in Europe, and that's the Andine lupine. Be Cool discussed the study case of rotational cropping in the workshop. The Siebler project study case was on black locust as a multi-purpose crop for nitrogen fixation and biomass production. And the 4Bio project had a study case on willow short rotation coppices on marginal land in the Ukraine. Now we will see the results from the evaluation of cropping innovations during the workshop. Let's have first a look at the economic perspective. For all discussed study cases, the range of impact on cost by land rental was low to average, but capacity development had average to high impact. Irrigation, if needed, also had high impact. But there were other features that were very case dependent. For example, the planting material for miscanthus establishment have a high impact on costs, while seeds for example, willow and short rotation coppices or crops in rotational cropping have rather low impact on total production costs. But what changes in biomass production cost can we expect in future? There are only few infos that can be found in the literature about this. Here we listed cost reduction potentials that we found in the literature or that we calculated from published costs for some innovations. A potential to reduce biomass production cost was calculated to be around 10% for changes in the miscanthus propagation methods, which include breeding, and 7% to management aspects as the planting density or the application of seed sludge to short rotation coppices. In contrast, cropping on marginal land, as you can see on the right side of the table, rather increase biomass production costs. Besides cropping innovations, there are also other effects as upscaling the cropping area and learning effects, which might include several innovations. We added this as the learning effect was found to have the highest potential to decrease costs. To get more data on how innovations can change costs, we also looked at yields, as yields per ton are directly linked to the biomass costs. Changes of biomass yield can also be positive or negative, depending on the innovation. We see yield reduction when cropping on marginal land compared to agricultural land again, but this might be outbalanced partly by breeding that increases, for example, the crop's drought resistance or the nutrient use efficiency. Most of the field studies so far were done on the plot scale, but due to edge effects and more intensive management, yield can be much higher on small plots compared to large fields. Therefore, it's very important to report study details on field site, which is not always done. Also for this table, the learning effect has the highest potential to increase yields and hence reduce biomass production costs. Coming to the workshop results on the environmental impact now. The environmental impact of study cases was expected to be rather positive for soil quality aspects, but negative for water availability and water quality. Other features as biodiversity, nutrient retention, and greenhouse gas emissions depended very much on the specific case. But this is probably also true for soil quality features as soil organic carbon. To illustrate this, here you see an example of soil organic carbon in the topsoil of several short rotation corpuses established on cropland. On the x-axis, you see the initial soil organic carbon content before the land use change, and on the y-axis, the percentage of soil organic carbon change after several years of short rotation corpuses. The color code indicates the clay content. And you can see that depending on the initial soil organic carbon content and the clay content, even losses of soil organic carbon might take place. And this translates into greenhouse gas emissions instead of sequestration. Therefore, again, I want to emphasize how important it is to access and document certain features of our European study cases. Workshop results on innovation acceptance. First, we look at the implementation barriers for farmers. For all study cases discussed in the workshop, the biggest barriers were cost and risk related. Tradition and habit of farmers also were an important barrier, but consistent biomass quality was regarded to be less relevant. We also saw that either the lack of standards and regulation or the lack of knowledge of environmental constraints, as for example invasiveness or soil quality, were high weight barriers for the implementation of innovations by farmers. After the implementation of innovations, their success also depends on the acceptance by the public. The acceptance can be low due to competing interests, for example, for food and feed, but also due to the lack of knowledge by the public. An upscaling of the cropping area can, for example, lead to shared cost, as increased traffic of heavy trucks. In contrast, shared benefits might include employment increase or positive environmental effects. Other aspects can be low or high depending on the case, as the visual landscape change and environmental values. Up to date, only few publications exist concerning these aspects, but in the end, they might decide about the success of innovations. Coming to the conclusions. As we have seen, the highest potential to reduce biomass costs is by the combination of several innovations at once, and we call this the learning effect. And therefore, the aim should be to accelerate this learning effect. The ongoing project, H2020 project, Panacea, is a brilliant example of the establishment of a network of actors with the aim to create an inventory of scientific results and communication of results, as well as networking and training. The second conclusion is that the evaluation of cropping innovations is very complex and highly case-specific. To cope with the complexity, we need a tool. The MAGIC project is developing a decision support system as a tool with guidelines for growing industrial crops under marginal conditions. In the long term, such a system needs to include infos on costs, sustainability, and social acceptance. But for this, we need reliable data. The Panacea network is collecting data actively, but it would be easier if future study cases report their standard data sets in a central and freely accessible database. A perfect example for a suitable and open accessible database is the one compiled by Wiley. It contains almost 2,000 data points on yields in 124 study sites. And remember that yields are directly related to feedstock production costs. As you can see here, a high number of actual and past study sites for lignocellulosic crops exist in Europe. In addition to yield modeling results, which we have in Europe, we need to make use of this knowledge gained from the study cases in order to judge about yields and hence feedstock production costs, depending on, for example, land type as illustrated here. I thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Sonja, for this interesting presentation and keeping the time. Questions will be saved for the end, and we will directly move on to the second speech. And the second speaker of today is Lars Wietschel. Lars is a scientific researcher at the University of Augsburg in Germany in the field of bioeconomy. He is participating in the EU research project REHAB that aims to create novel materials from agriculture and forestry waste. And REHAB is also funded by the Horizon 2020 SPIRE program. For the REHAB project, Lars has been responsible for assessing the agroforestry potential for the bioeconomy in the European Union. And in his presentation, Lars will tell us more about that work. So please, Lars, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bert, for the presentation, for the introduction for the presentation. Thank you, Sonja, for the very interesting presentation you held before. Like Bert said before, I'm from the University of Augsburg, and I'm working in the assessment of the status and future perspective of agroforestry residue potentials in the European Union. I'm working in a project called REHAB, the acronym, and the full name is Systematic Approach to Reduce Energy Demand and CO2 Emissions of Processes that Transform Agroforestry Waste into High Added Value Products. The products REHAB aims to produce polyurethane adhesives, green concrete, wooden panels, and insulation foams. The feedstock REHAB will be using, or REHAB is using, is straw residues and forestry residues, mainly bark. Like I said before, our part is the assessment of feedstock potentials. We subdivided the assessment into following questions. Which are the most abundant lignocellulose residues in the EU? Where are the lignocellulose residues regionally distributed? And especially also, how will the residue potentials develop in the future? We answer the questions about the abundance of lignocellulose residues by a differentiation into different potentials and assess the broad range of different residues. Not all available residues are directly usable. Therefore, we distinguish between the theoretical potential, which covers all available residues of one certain crop in the EU, the technical potential, which reduces the theoretical potential by issues of law, sustainability, and technical limitations. In the technical potential, for example, we address aspects like the soil quality and the incorporation of a certain share of agricultural residues into soil again. And finally, the bioeconomic potential, which further reduces the technical potential by competitive applications. Competitive applications for straw can be, for example, animal bedding or straw-based compost for food production, and so on. In the agricultural sector, we especially looked at cereals, legumes, oil crops, sugar crops, and fiber plants. In the forestry sector, we focused especially on coniferous bark, as in our project also tannin is of interest, which can be extracted in considerable amounts from coniferous bark. From a broad range of investigated crops in the agricultural sector, wheat straw, maize stover, rapeseed straw, and barley straw showed the highest potentials. Together, they make up about 80% of the oil crop harvest of the harvesting residues. Spruce bark and pine bark are the main bark residues from the industrial roundwood sector in the EU. This slide gives a brief outline of some of our results regarding the most abundant lignocellulose residues. In the agricultural sector, over 110 million tons of bioeconomic straw potential is available. About 80% of the dry matter is cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin, which are the base compounds for rehab processes. Wheat straw is with nearly 50 million tons, the most abundant agricultural residue in the EU. It is followed by corn stover with about 30 million tons, barley straw with 16 million tons, and rapeseed straw with about 14 million tons. In the forestry sector, about 15 million tons of spruce and pine bark are available. This is obviously lower than volumes we found for the agricultural sector. However, bark is available in large amounts at distinct locations, like pulp and paper mills or sawmills, which makes its collection way easier than the collection of agricultural residues, which is spread more or less evenly in area. Like mentioned before, spruce and pine bark is composed of a considerable amount of extractable tannin. Tannin can play an important role in the production of biophenolic resins, which is part of the research in our project. Knowing which agroforestry residues are abundant is important, but of similar importance is the regional distributions of the residues. Wheat straw is cultivated all over the EU. Central EU shows the highest potentials. Even though wheat straw is cultivated all over the EU, in some regions there is already a high demand in wheat straw, a higher demand in wheat straw than the current supply. The demand from current application exceeds the regional production, mainly due to animal bedding. This is true, for example, for parts of Ireland, Netherlands, or Scandinavian countries. For maize stover, the maize stover is mainly found in Central European countries and hardly found in northern regions. Barley straw is hardly cultivated in southern regions, but more in central and northern regions. And rapeseed straw is also hardly found in southern regions. And again, Central European countries and regions have the highest potentials. In the next step of the project, we predicted how the feedstock potentials could develop until the year 2030. To do the forecast, we analyzed historic time series of underlying variables like crop yields, historic crop yields, and the development of yields, the cultivated area, historic cultivated area, etc. And we also looked at other market forecasts for the different main or primary crops. From this, we got a time series and literature-based forecast. About the methodology, you could find something in our publication regarding this topic. For wheat straw, we predicted increasing volumes of about 10% within the next years. So wheat straw will stay the most important crop, and of course also the crop with the highest residue potentials, especially in Central and Eastern European countries like Bulgaria, Estonia, Poland, or Romania. The growth rates could be high. This is due to increasing crop yields, as farming patterns are still improving, are still catching up with Central European countries. The cultivated area of wheat straw is not likely to increase much in the upcoming years. For maize stover, we also predict rising volumes. Again, mainly Central and Eastern European countries contribute to this development. The crop yields are also developing positive. Additionally, for maize, even the area on which it is cultivated could slightly increase until the year 2030. For barley straw, our prediction says a more or less stable supply within the next years. maybe a slight increase in a few regions. And for rapeseed straw, our forecast says that it's likely to decline by a few percent until 2030. This is mainly driven by a contraction of the demand for vegetable oil and first-generation bioethanol, and therefore decreasing cultivated cropping areas. Summing up, we predict the overall agricultural potentials to moderately rise from about 110 million tons today to a level of about 125 million tons in 2030. Here you see the spruce and pine bark potentials in the EU. Important to mention is the annual fluctuation in volumes, as the wood availability is strongly dependent on, for example, storm events. Obviously, Sweden and Finland are the most important spruce and pine bark suppliers, or spruce and pine wood suppliers in the EU. However, also South Germany, for example, and parts of Austria supply considerable amounts of spruce bark. Pine bark is more spread to different regions in the EU, especially Poland is also a very important pine bark supplier. Predictions in the availability of volumes are quite difficult, as we are in the middle of a transformation towards forests which are less vulnerable to climate change. So therefore, we did not do a prediction on bark volumes for the next few years. Thank you very much.
Lars, thank you for your contribution. We will now move to the third and last presentation of this webinar. The presentation will be given by Bart Tambuyser, the owner and managing director of CAPAX Biobased Development. That's a Belgium SME and specializing in turning bio-based products into success. For more than 20 years, Bart has been working in the field of bioeconomy to make bio-based products thriving. The company uses disruptive approaches to facilitate investors, technology providers, and project development in order to take the right decision, answer real market demands, and find new market opportunities and boost their sales. CAPAX is one of the partners in Bio4Products, and today Bart will talk about virtual pyrolysis plant locations, the availability and quality of biomass. So please, Bart, go ahead.
First of all, thank you for the introduction, Bert. I will talk today about the principle of virtual pyrolysis plant locations, and I will do this in relation to the availability and quality of biomass. So first of all, a small outline. I will address as a start the point of how do you make a bio-based, an industrial bio-based project bankable. Why did we use this VPL approach? Something more about feedstock availability, feedstock quality, and how did we end up choosing the specific VPLs, and a short summary. So first of all, how would you make a bio-based project bankable? Because at the end of the day, that's the aim, to have a feasible business case. For this, I will say it in short, it's important that you secure the ins and the outs of your project. What do I mean with that? When I talk about the ins, I'm talking about the feedstock. And it's important that you secure your feedstock at least, ideally, 5 to 10 years. If not, it will be very difficult to convince an investor or a banker to invest in your project. The out, with that I mean sales. You also need to have sales agreements, contracts, so that you can prove that there is a business case. Now, in order to assess your project, it's important that you do a profound surrounding analysis that takes into account all these aspects. And this is what our core business is as CAPAX. Now, telling something about, and in fact it's a term that we came up with within the Bio4Products project, saying something about virtual pyrolysis plant locations. Why did we do that? At the start of the project, we knew that we wanted to look for feedstocks, so biomass feedstocks within the EU zone, and that we also wanted to develop potential scenarios in the EU zone. It was also known from the start that we were going to target residual lignocellulosic feedstocks, and we decided to do that aiming at 3 domains. So lignocellulosics coming from agriculture, forestry, or food or feed processing. Now, why did we then use these virtual plant locations? We did that because we wanted to do surrounding analysis and feedstock analysis that were as realistic as possible. So we wanted to have, let's say, kind of tangible business cases. I will later on go a bit deeper on the site choices that we made, and first I will now say something more about biomass availability. So several aspects were also mentioned in the previous presentations, but it's important when you're talking about biomass availability, you're not only talking about the amount that is available, the quantities that are available. You also need to look at other parameters, like for instance, what are the competitive uses of the feedstock, what are they today, what will they be in the future. Price, it's also pointed out, it's a very important aspect. In brief, if you can pay the price for the feedstock, the chance is of course much higher that you will get the necessary feedstock. And this is strongly related also to the competitiveness of your project. In brief, the added value that you can create. The higher the added value you can create, the more you are able to pay a price that for the feedstock that you would need. Technology needs to be ideally as flexible as possible. What do I mean with that? If you are targeting only one specific type of feedstock, it's of course a less favorable negotiation position that you're into to secure your feedstock. Ideally, you have a technology that is flexible so that you can aim and look at different types of feedstock. Logistics. In biomass, logistics are very important, so you need to see how accessible is your project. Is it only available by road or also waterway? How easy is it for suppliers to supply biomass to your plant? Is it just in time, or do you have storing capacity? And of course, you have the sustainability aspects. How far away do you need to source your biomass? What is the impact of specific feedstocks on the environment? So just to make clear that you need to take into account different parameters when you are assessing the availability of your feedstock. On the right side of the presentation, you can see the final feedstocks that we chose within the Bio4Products project. We investigated many more feedstocks. But at the end, we wanted to investigate larger volumes, and these are the 3 feedstocks that we withheld: wheat straw, sawmill residue, which we call slabs. So these are sidings from tree stems, and sunflower husk. I will not go more into detail. You can find this more in detail in the public report. Now, in order to come to this feedstock selection, we use the scoring system. it's fair to say that it's good not to only base your conclusions on numbers. There are also, let's say, expert point of views that you ideally take into account. And last but not least, there is a correlation between the site choices and the feedstock choices that we made. To say something about quality. Of course, you are also looking for a feedstock that suits your project. There can be, or there are physical characteristics. Some examples, it can be about granulometry, it can be about density, humidity, and then, of course, you are also looking at the chemical composition. As we said, for products and the BTG pyrolysis process, we target feedstocks that are rich in lignocellulosic materials. So we also looked into the composition of the different feedstocks that we targeted. Apart from the quality of a feedstock in theory, you also need to take into account parameters that can influence the quality of a feedstock because of weather conditions, the harvesting operations. To give a practical example, are you harvesting in wet conditions, dry conditions? Because of that, you can contaminate your feedstock with soil. So you will end up having more minerals in your process, which are less desirable. Also, during logistics, you can get contaminations. You can get them also while storing your biomass because you use, let's say, a bulldozer to load your biomass, but the bulldozer was contaminated with some residue. So these are important aspects to take into account when you look into the quality of the feedstock. And of course, the feedstock choice is in relation to the technology, the conversion technology. Now, to say something more about the VPL locations, what did we do? We said that, okay, we want to have, let's say, kind of tangible business cases within the EU zone. And we also wanted a kind of geographical spread. So you will see we ended up with a scenario in Finland. We have a scenario in Romania. We have one in France and another one in the Netherlands. But we didn't only look at these ones. At the start of the project, we looked much broader. And you can see on the map that there are logos of factories that are in gray. And these are the regions that we looked into, but at the end of the day didn't consider. Now, apart from this geographical spread, we also wanted different feedstock scenarios. So for Finland, we looked into forestry, softwood forestry residues. For Romania, we targeted a food processing feedstock, being sunflower husk. For France, we decided that we also wanted a multi-feedstock scenario, what I pointed out at the start of the presentation. So ideally, you have the options to process more feedstocks. And in France, we looked at a scenario with flax chives, poplar slab residues, and wheat straw residues. And then last but not last is the scenario in the Netherlands. Of course, it's maybe not the most ideal region to source a feedstock, but there were other advantages because we also looked into industrial symbiosis aspects. And we decided, because of this reason of the competitiveness for feedstocks, to look at something more alternative. And so we looked into short rotation copies of poplar, but this on mildly polluted lands. So where you use the poplars as a phytoremediation technology. So in summary, if you are developing a Biobased project, it's key that you can secure your feedstock on the long term. In order to do that, it's important that you do a profound feedstock assessment at the start, and you need to take into account many aspects. And if you are not sure at the start where you would develop your project, and still you want to do realistic surrounding analysis, it can be a good tool to work with this principle of using virtual plant locations. Now there is much more data available, and there is not enough time to go very deep into that. So I suggest to have a look at the website of Bio4Products, and then you can look for publications, and there you will find the detailed dossier. So that's it for me. I thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Bart, for this presentation, and now we will continue with the Q&A session. We will try to answer as many questions as possible, but in case yours is not answered, please contact us directly by email. We will do our best to provide an answer afterwards. We already received a number of questions. I have a first question to Sonja. You were talking about lignocellulosic crops on marginal lands, and the question is whether that's profitable already today.
So thank you for this question. I think you have to distinguish on what kind of marginal land you look at. So land could be marginal due to the soil quality, or maybe due to the distance to where it is needed or where people are living. So if the soil quality is not good, then it's probably not profitable if you just want to make money out of it. But if you have other reasons to grow the crops there, then it might be still a good idea. For example, as we just heard, the poplar as a phytoremediation. So if these aspects get paid for in kind of subsidies, then it also might become profitable on marginal land that's marginal due to the soil quality. Does this answer the question? I think so.
Okay, thank you. I see a question maybe I can answer, and is the report from CAPAX available? I think the answer is yes, it is available on the website of Bio4Products, so you can download it there. Another question is for Lars. Do you foresee any improvement in the availability of forestry residues, and is there any effect of the current climate changes on the availability?
Thank you for the question. It's very difficult to say how climate change affects the availability of forestry residues. In the moment, we see a change in the forests. So different type of trees are planted, and there is a lot of research in what trees might what trees can stand the climate change. Does it answer the question?
I think so. And in the meantime, I see another question for you. And do regional price supply curves exist for the different feedstock types you described? It's also for Lars.
Yes, thank you for the question. We calculated price supply curves for the different types of feedstocks. And so, yes, it does exist, but we did not publicate it yet.
Okay.
Maybe, here's Sonja speaking, maybe I can just give you a hint that the S2 Biome project also did provide such price supply curves, so maybe that's an option to look there.
Okay, thank you. Also a question for Bart. And you described this virtual plant locations. Is the same principle also usable by other bioeconomy projects or business cases?
Yes, for sure. Of course, you wouldn't call it a virtual pyrolysis plant location, but the principle of virtual plant locations you can use for different scenarios.
Okay. Another one for Lars. And do you have any recommendations to improve the technical potential of biomass, and meaning to adopt a favorable policy framework or something like that, or without compromising on the sustainability criteria? You're still there, Lars? Maybe not. And we'll first continue with a question for Sonja. Which cropping innovations have the highest potential to expand the supply of lignocellulosic biomass?
Yes, as I said, there was not really a single one innovation that had the biggest potential that we could apply everywhere, but it's rather the combination of different innovations. So, for example, from breeding, from agricultural management. So we need the knowledge. Then the knowledge needs to be spread, and combining this together, that has the potential to reduce the costs. Yeah.
Okay. A question to Bart. You were mentioning that logistics are very important, logistics, transport. What is a reasonable distance to transport biomass, and is it different for different types of feedstock?
Can you repeat your question, Bert?
The logistics are very important for biomass, and what is a reasonable distance to transport biomass, and is it different for different types of biomass?
Yeah, of course, it's a lot related to the density of a type of biomass. So when you use pellets, you augment drastically the density of the biomass, and then in theory you could say you can, or even in reality, you can source your biomass further away. But the further you go, the higher the impact on CO2 is. So within Bio4 products, we took into account that we would source the biomass within an axis radius, let's say, of 75 to 100 kilometers.
Okay, and is it different for different types of biomass?
Yeah, as I said, it's a lot related to the density, and the density you can augment via different techniques like baling or densifying, briquetting, pelletizing. So yeah, you need to really look case by case. What or how far away you would source your biomass.
Okay, there's another question for you. How important are the economies of scale when you look at these fertile pyrolysis plant locations?
Yeah, I think in every business case it's important. And the study that we did was based on a realistic scenario where BTG develops a pyrolysis oil plant.
Mm-hmm. And
correct me if I'm wrong, Bert. And maybe you can say something about that more, but we took that into account.
I have a question, more general question, maybe to all three presenters. What you see with biomass availability, there seems to be something like a vanishing biomass story. There is enough until you start to do something with it, and then it becomes very expensive or difficult to access. And how is this taken into account in models, and if so, how it is done? Who would like to answer?
I like to answer. I think that's a very good question, a very important question, and probably I don't have a perfect answer, but one answer is it depends maybe on whom produce it is and for what it is used. So, for example, if it's very decentralized, then it may still be possible to use it for the purpose it was foreseen in the first time. So, for example, here at ATB, we have heating systems and we have our own poplar plantations for that. So even though the price will increase, we still will use our poplars for heating here.
Okay, that's nice. And maybe one related to that then, if you look at the current biomass availability, is it sufficient to match the needs for a bioeconomy, and is it sufficient to substitute fossil fuels? Who could answer this question?
Of course, it's not enough, but it's one part of the solution, in my opinion.
Okay. Maybe another question also to Bart. You mentioned the importance of biomass supply contracts to make a project bankable.
Yes.
You should have a good quality biomass, but at the same time, you also mentioned that there is an influence of weather conditions on biomass quality. Well,
indeed,
you can't control weather, right? How do you take that into account in the contracts?
Yeah, but nonetheless, you ask your suppliers to respect certain quality parameters. There is, in reality, there is, let's say, a min and max zone that you need to respect. And how do you deal with that is to make sure that you have different suppliers. Also that you have, ideally you have enough storing capacity so that you can make blends on site. So there are different ways of dealing with that. As I pointed out, ideally you also have a technology that can process different types of, in this case, let's say lignocellulosic feedstocks. But indeed, the weather you cannot control, so you need to be creative and flexible.
And the question related to that then, what were the gate fee or the prices, the biomass prices or the ranges you used within your study?
Well, what do you mean there, Bert? Because, okay, we have different feedstocks and we have different pricings in respect to different feedstocks.
Okay. And the data can be found in the report, I assume, huh?
And the data is to be found in the report, yes, indeed. But of course, it's also important to point out, you have a snapshot. So as we said, we were working with realistic, as possible realistic scenarios. You make a snapshot, and then okay, you can try to estimate how prices would evolve. But if you are looking further than 3 years, I think you start to look into a crystal ball. That's a long time in business. So prices, they are real benchmark prices, but it's a snapshot in time.
Okay. Maybe one final question. Looking at the time, we have one final question, maybe to all of you. And what future trends do you foresee regarding availability of different kinds of biomass? And is competition particularly high for one or another biomass type? Who would like to answer? No volunteers?
I'm thinking about my answer. Now, I think it's fair to say if you are going more and more to a bio-based economy society, the interest for biomass will rise. So it's an offer and demand aspect that comes into play. I would not try to make estimations if one type of biomass will be more looked for than another type, because this is strongly related to technology development and also market demands. But in general, I think the conclusion will be that the interest for biomass will rise. I think also biomass, as a result, biomass prices will go up, because today there is still a lot of biomass that is, let's say, low at a low price, valorized for, let's say, making energy out of it. And the more and more we will use even residual biomass to give high added value applications, the value and the cost of the biomass will rise in time. This is my best guess.
Okay, thank you. And thank you to all the speakers. We will now come to the end of this first webinar. If you need more information or you have unanswered questions, you can always contact us. This webinar has been recorded and will be available on the Bio4Products website. As mentioned before, we will organize another 3 webinars related to this Bio4Products in the coming months, and details will be or become available on our website as shown on the screen. The next one will be on November 14, and then we will talk about the development of a pyrolysis-based biorefinery. Thank you all for participating, and thanks to the speakers, and hopefully we can welcome you again at one of our next webinars. Thank you.